I was going to start with an Ole joke, but I think we know them all.
Why not?
The point is, when we hear the name Ole, we think Norwegian. Even though there were Swedes and Danes with that name, nevertheless, Ole was overwhelmingly the most common male name in Norway for centuries. And Ole is, of course, and it's actually Ole in Norwegian, and it's an elided form of Olaf, because Olaf was the national hero and patron saint of Norway. And how that came about is the subject of this talk. It's about the national myth of Norway, the national epic of Norway. It's a story of two kings named Olaf, and also of a remarkable man named Erling Skjalgsson, who, in my opinion, has not gotten his proper due in history. During the Viking Age, there was a barrier between Scandinavia and the rest of Europe. This story starts in the 10th century. And that was well along in the Viking Age, but the barrier still existed. The barrier was cultural, it was political, it was religious. We often think of the violence coming south from Scandinavia to the rest of Europe, but in fact, it went both ways. There was violence coming from the south too, up towards Scandinavia, and it was all due, or largely due, to a man you all learned about in school, Charlemagne, Charles the Great, towering figure in European history. For the purposes of this story, he's the bad guy. He put constant pressure on Scandinavia, especially on Denmark. He ruled by what I'm going to call the Charlemagne principle. That's just a term I use. It's nothing official. But his ideas of rulership were that the king should be the supreme authority. The king was God's representative. To obey the king was to obey God. All power flowed from the king. If anyone exercised power in the kingdom, he did it on behalf of the king. Religious conformity. On at least one occasion, Charlemagne massacred thousands of heathens after first baptizing them and then massacring them. As a Christian myself, I find this appalling. I have a hard time understanding how anyone would think that would be a good way to spread the faith, but it was very popular in the 8th century, and Charlemagne's descendants, his successors, carried on that policy. So whatever happens in the Viking Age, you've got to bear in mind that they were dealing with an aggressive, totalitarian force on their southern border. We're going to look at Denmark again and again during this talk, even though it's about Norway. This is because some years ago I had an epiphany. I realized that you can understand everything that happens in the Viking Age pretty much if you understand what's going on in Denmark. Denmark is the center of gravity. Everything relates to Denmark or is a reaction to Denmark. The Kingdom of Denmark, it had its southern border in those days where that red line is, much further south than it is today. Denmark had strategic importance. It controlled, as you can see, the entrance to the Baltic. That was a very important and very profitable situation for the King of Denmark to be in. Cultural importance. Everything that came from Europe to Scandinavia came to Denmark first. The Viking Age was a time of great cultural change, and those changes all happened first in Denmark. Denmark was the center of power. The King of Denmark controlled not only what we think of as Denmark today, the peninsula and the islands. He controlled a large part of Norway. In the eastern part, the area around Oslo. He controlled large parts of what is today Sweden. He considered himself, rightly, the overlord of all Scandinavia. Other Scandinavians, of course, had other ideas, and this caused some strange bedfellows. For instance, an English-Norwegian alliance. The first diplomatic relations we know of between Norway and England go back to the time of Athelstan the Great of England and Harald Finehair of Norway, who we think of as the first king of a united Norway. They had a common interest in opposing the power of Denmark. If Harald wanted to have an independent Norwegian kingdom, he had to do something about that Danish enclave in Norway. So the friendship throughout most of history, Norway and England have been friends, and that friendship goes all the way back to the Viking Age. Now, Norway had a very different political tradition than the Charlemagne principle. Norway went back to the old Germanic tradition. The old Germanic tradition, you can read about it in the Latin historian Tacitus, was a democratic tradition. The king had limited power. He might inherit his, and he might be not called a king, he might be called a jarl, might be called a herser, but he might inherit his title, but it had to be ratified by the election of the Thing, the assembly of the free men, and sometimes some of the women. The Norwegian tradition, the king depended on the support of his chief men. That's why in the sagas you're always reading about great feasts. Feasts were an important part of the political system. At a feast, the king fed his supporters, and food is really important in a marginal economy, and he gave them gifts, expensive gifts. That's probably one of the main reasons the Vikings raided so much. They needed expensive stuff to give their supporters, and the cheapest way to get it was stealing it. The king, if he did not give satisfaction, he could be kicked out. And when he was kicked out, very often he was killed. It happened time and time again. There was a balance of power. So onto this scene comes the first Olaf, King Olaf Tryggvason, the most romantic of all the Viking kings. He was a descendant of petty kings in the eastern part of Norway who would have paid tribute to Denmark. And according to the sagas, he had a rip-snorter of a childhood. He and his mother were kidnapped by Vikings at sea. They were sold as slaves in Estonia. Olaf spent some time as a slave as a boy, and then he was recognized in a marketplace by a kinsman, and the kinsman bought his freedom. That kinsman was in the service of Prince Vladimir of Kiev in Russia. So Olaf served King Vladimir for a while, and then he became a freelance Viking and mercenary, generally in the Baltic, but eventually found his way to England. In England, he raided along with King Svein Forkbeard of Denmark. And according to the sagas, he was baptized into Christianity by a monk or a hermit in the Scilly Isles who made prophecies about his glorious future. In fact, he was probably baptized in an agreement with King Ethelred the Unready. And he seems to have taken his Christianity seriously, but he doesn't seem to have understood it very well. Now, Ethelred the Unready has a bad reputation in history, and in many ways he deserved it. However, he had a very long reign, which very few kings managed to do, so that's something to say for him. He was under pressure from these Danes and Norwegians who were marching around his islands and burning and harrying. So he decided on a divide and conquer policy, and he took a gamble on this young man, Olaf Tryggvason. He offered Olaf, if you will be baptized, I will give you money to go to Norway and set yourself up as a king. Olaf agreed. He sailed to Norway with 21,000 pounds of English silver in his ships. Tremendous sum of money, raised by a special tax. And he was lucky in his timing. The Norwegians were tired, sick to death of Jarl Håkon of Ladir, who was their ruler up to that point, and they were ready for a change. However, Olaf wasn't exactly the change they were hoping for. He subdued various districts quite quickly, and he operated on the Charlemagne principle. Everyone had to be baptized or die, at least according to the sagas. He also practiced torture, which was not in the Norwegian tradition. So there was some unhappiness about this. However, when he got to Vestland, the southwestern part of Norway, he met with a different reception. In Vestland, they neither fought him nor bowed to him immediately. They offered him a business proposition. We will let you be king if you will marry your sister Astrid to our young man Erling Skjalgsson of Sola, whom we consider the most promising young man in the country. Olaf agreed. This picture of Erling Skjalgsson, by the way, was painted by a young man who is here tonight, Jeremiah Humphreys. Right there, would you stand up, Jeremiah? He is available for commissions, right?
That's true, yeah.
Okay. Erling Skjalgsson came from a very important family in the southwest of Norway, in Rogaland, which is the area around Stavanger. In fact, he was the ruler of Rogaland. He was probably already a Christian, and this is a point that ought to be made. The sagas give the impression that Norway was completely heathen, and the two Olafs came in and single-handedly converted everybody. In fact, every archaeological evidence says that Norway had been that Christianity had been growing in Norway for a considerable time, especially in the southwest where Erling lived. Christianity had pretty deep roots by this time. The sagas tell us that he had a self-help program for his slaves. He gave them free time every day in which they could work at a craft or till a piece of land, and any money they made, they could use to buy their freedom. And then Erling would take that money, buy more slaves, offer them the same deal. It was sort of a revolving fund. And this is one of the things that makes him an appealing character in the sagas. And incidentally, he is the hero of a series of novels that I am writing. These are the ones that have been published to date. The Year of the Warrior, West Oversea, Hailstone Mountain. All of them are available as ebooks from Amazon. Only the one in the middle, West Oversea, is still available on Dead Tree version. And I have some copies here in case anyone wants to pick one up afterwards. Now, Erling did a strange thing at the wedding, surprised Olaf probably. Olaf offered him the title of Jarl, which is equivalent to Earl. It was a higher title than Erling's own title of Herser. Erling said, no, I only want to be a Herser. It was the title that he inherited from his father and the title he was elected to by his people. It was a bottom-up title, not a top-down title. What he was saying to Olaf is, I will serve you, but not under the Charlemagne principle. I will be your man, I will not be your vassal. Now, what I'm going to say here is theory. I have translated a book by a Norwegian historian, and they tell me it's going to be coming out this spring, but I've been disappointed before. Watch for it. It's called The Viking Heritage by Professor Torgrim Titlestad of the University of Stavanger. And he has a theory, and this is not proven, I'm just sharing his theory with you. He believes that Erling and Olaf came to an accommodation, a compromise, that Norway would be Christian, but the traditional rites would be observed, that Olaf would not be an absolute monarch, but he would respect the local chieftains and the assemblies and their decisions. This may be true or it may be not. in any case, it became a moot point fairly soon. We're going to turn back to Denmark now. I said we were going to keep checking on Denmark. King Svein Forkbeard of Denmark, as we said, had raided along with Olaf Tryggvason in England. Now he had lost an ally, and worse than that, Olaf Tryggvason was now a threat to his Norwegian possessions. Olaf didn't want the eastern Norway to be under Denmark. He wanted it as part of Norway. That was a threat to Svein. On top of that, Olaf was sending Vikings to raid in the Danish homeland. Well, couldn't put up with that. So he made an alliance with King Olaf Skotkonung of Sweden and Jarl Erik, who was the son of the late Jarl Håkon. And Olaf Tryggvason turned out to be a bad investment for Ethelred the Unready. He only lasted 5 years. He made a fairly unnecessary voyage into the Baltic, where he was waylaid, which was just sailing right into the teeth of Svein Forkbeard, and he was met by a fleet of his enemies, and he was defeated in the battle and jumped overboard in full armor and ceased to be a political force. Now Norway was divided between Sweden and Denmark, and Jarl Erik's sons, Jarl Håkon's sons, were set in place as under jarls in service of those two countries. Meanwhile, Erling Skjalgsson, what is he doing? Erling paid no attention whatever to the new regime. He continued to control the lands that Olaf had given him, which was about this much of the country. And he also kept collecting the taxes, which he had always collected. Only in the past he'd had to give half of it to the king. Now he kept it all. And he thumbed his nose at the Danes and the Swedes both, and he was in a political position to do that. So we look back to Denmark. In 1002, Ethelred made the stupidest and wickedest of many stupid decisions in his reign, and he ordered all the main Danes in England to be massacred. It is said, we don't know for sure, that Svein's own sister was one of the victims. Svein immediately attacked England again and defeated Ethelred in 1013. However, in 1014, Svein died, and Ethelred came back from Normandy and set up as king again. Svein was succeeded by his son Canute the Great, who had the whole weary work of conquering England to do all over again now. In 1015, Jarl Erik was called to England to help Canute with his conquest. And at that point, Erling made peace with Erik's brothers. He could do that honorably because they weren't involved in killing his brother-in-law, Olaf Tryggvason. They confirmed him in all his old rights and possessions, and according to the sagas, some people even called him the King of Rogaland, although his real title still remained Herser. In 1014, a new Olaf appeared, a new claimant to the throne. This was Olaf Haraldsson. He was also the son of a petty king in the east of Norway. He was also a Viking, and quite a Viking. His nickname was Olaf Digre, Olaf the Stout. And that nickname meant more than fat. It meant stubborn. It meant someone who insisted on having his own way at all times, and that was Olaf down to the ground. He was probably baptized in Normandy, where he spent time, and he admired the kings of France and the dukes of Normandy, and they ruled under what principle, do you think? The Charlemagne principle. Like the first Olaf, he went to England. He was an ally of Canute there, and then he sailed off to Norway to become its king. Now here's an interesting point. According to English records, Olaf sailed to Norway as a vassal of King Canute. He was going to be Canute's under-king in Norway. The sagas don't say anything about that. And Olaf's own behavior, he simply went and set up for himself. It looks very much like he told Canute that he would be his under-king, but had no intention of doing that. In other words, it looks like he double-crossed Canute. Even more than that, and this is also only a possibility, there is circumstantial evidence that he might have done the same sort of deal that Olaf Tryggvason did and received a large amount of money from Ethelred in order to leave the country and get out of his hair. But the sagas say nothing of that because the sagas want to establish Olaf as a great hero and saint. Olaf quickly drove out Jarl Håkon's sons, and then he had a meeting with Erling Skjalgsson, and he made his demands. Erling would be Olaf's subordinate under the Charlemagne principle. Erling responded in his accustomed way. He paid no attention whatever. At that point, Erling had enough wealth and support among friends and kinsmen to be able to pull that off. So Olaf turned his attention to other projects, mainly the conversion of Norway by warfare and torture. In 1017, Olaf had strengthened his position enough so that he was able to force Erling to come to terms. Erling had to send one of his sons to Olaf's court to be one of his bodyguard. In fact, he was a hostage. Also, Erling was reduced in status. He had to accept the title Lenderman, which was a title bestowed by the king. It was a Charlemagne principle title. Erling had to swallow it for the time being. But a crisis came in 1022. What you see in the picture there is the 13th century church at a place called Avaldsnes on Karmøy Island in Norway. It's a place I'm fond of. My great-grandfather was baptized there. The church wasn't there in Olaf's time, but that's the place where the drama happened. Erling had a nephew named Asbjørn. He lived in the north of Norway. He wanted to hold one of those political feasts we talked about. He needed to brew beer, so he needed grain. He went south to buy grain from his uncle Erling. Now, King Olaf had made a law that no one from the south of the country could sell grain to anyone from the north of the country, probably to prevent just that kind of political feast. But Asbjørn thought he had found a way around when he went down to Erling, and instead of from buying it from his uncle, he bought it from Erling's slaves. However, he made the mistake of stopping at Avaldsnes on his way home. Avaldsnes was a royal farm. The king's steward there confiscated his entire cargo of grain. And worse than that almost, he also confiscated his beautiful ship's sail. He had a bright, brand new sail on his ship that he had sailed down with. The steward took that sail away, gave him a ragged old faded one from out of a storehouse, and he had to sail back with that. So that not only had he suffered the injury of losing his grain, he had suffered the insult, and a public insult, because he was flying the symbol of his humiliation from the yardarm of his ship. He was publicly humiliated. The Vikings lived in an honor-based culture. In an honor-based culture, you do not accept a public insult. The person who made the insult has to be made to pay, preferably by death. The steward should have expected that. What happened was that Asbjørn heard that King Olaf was going to be spending Easter at Avaldsnes. So he sailed south again. He put in on the west side of the island, put on a disguise, and went all alone, walked across the island to the king's hall. He walked into the king's hall where the steward was talking to the king, and he struck the king's head off right in front of the king. His head rolled up against his feet. Of course, Olaf was furious, and he wanted to hang Asbjørn on the spot. But as we said, Erling's son, his name was Skjalg, was there, and he persuaded the king that it would be improper to hang a man during the Easter holiday, best to wait after church Sunday morning. So Olaf reluctantly had Asbjørn locked up. And then Skjalg got a boat and quickly sailed over the Boknasund to his father at Sola. This wall is located just south of the church at Avaldsnes today. They told me that this is the place where the old wooden church stood in the Viking Age. And when Olaf came out of church that Sunday morning, he found Erling Skjalgsson waiting for him with 1,400 men. Olaf had no choice. He had to accept a payment of money for the murder of his steward. In theory, the two men were reconciled. In fact, of course, now it was Olaf who had been publicly humiliated. Anyone who was there could have predicted that one of these men was going to be the death of the other. In fact, as it worked out, they were both arguably the death of the other. In Erling became Canute's man. He transferred his loyalty to King Canute. He even went to England for a couple of years and lived there. In 1026, Canute attacked Norway, and Erling and his sons were with him with the fleet. In 1028, Olaf had to flee. By now, he had almost no friends left in the country. Everyone was sick of him. On St. Thomas Day, December 21st, 1028, Olaf's 3 ships sailed past Erling's domains. Erling's lookouts saw them. Erling quickly called up a muster of ships and went after him. Erling had a very fast ship. He had the fastest ship in Norway. He was sailing ahead of the rest of his fleet to keep Olaf in sight so they wouldn't lose him. Olaf took advantage of this. He tricked him. He had his ships lower their sails very slowly. It looked as if the ships were disappearing over the horizon in the distance. Erling fell for it. So he was all alone when Olaf and his 3 ships ambushed him between 2 islands. In the Heimskringla, the Sagas of the Kings of Norway, it says that this happened at a place called Soknesund. More recent scholarship suggests it was probably Boknasund, which is this place. Erling's entire crew was massacred. Finally, it was just Erling alone, standing in the stern of his ship, defending himself single-handed. It was remembered as the greatest single-handed defense that had ever been seen in the North. And Erling was certainly at least 50 years old at this point. According to the saga, he accepted quarter from Olaf, agreed to be his man. I have trouble with this story. From what I know about Erling, I don't think he would have submitted to Olaf just to save his life with the bodies of his dead comrades all around him. I believe one of two things happened. Either Olaf offered him a major concession, some sort of compromise, like the agreement he'd had with Olaf Tryggvason, or else the whole thing is political spin and Erling was simply murdered. In any case, one of Olaf's men ran forward and killed Erling with an axe. Olaf cried out, "You have struck Norway from my hand." With Erling's support, he could have hoped to regain his power. Without him, he had no choice but to flee. He fled to Russia, as so many Norwegian kings did over the centuries. He spent 2 years in Russia. According to the sagas, he became more reflective, more observant of his Christianity, and a kinder man during that period. In 1030, he returned to Norway with a small army. Note I say small army. It is really a puzzle what he thought he was going to do with the size of the army he had to conquer all of Norway. It looks like either he was expecting a miracle from God, or he was just on a suicide mission and looking for martyrdom. In any case, he met an army of farmers, many of them Erling Skjalgson's friends, at Stiklestad on July 29, 1030. According to the sagas, he gave his priests silver to pay for prayers for the souls of his enemies who would die that day. That's taken as a sign of his changed nature. During the battle, he was killed. The saga says that he cast away his sword before the final blow fell on him. Technically, that made it a martyrdom. So now we turn back to Denmark. What about Denmark now? Well, Denmark's in a very good position. Canute had conquered England in 1018. He was now the king of Denmark, England, Norway, and large parts of Sweden. This was the height of Danish power in the Viking Age. You might call it the first British Empire. In Norway, there began to be stories of miraculous healings. Men who touched Olaf's blood had their wounds quickly healed. They said people saw strange lights hovering over his grave at night. And when he was moved from his grave, they said the body was uncorrupted, which was always considered a sign of sainthood. In more practical terms, the Danish rule turned out less pleasant than they had expected. The chieftains had expected to be put in charge of Norway under Canute. Instead, he sent in his illegitimate son and his mistress to rule them. They were not happy about that. And Olaf's reign began to look like the good old days. Belief in Olaf's sanctity grew and grew. The Norwegians finally summoned Olaf's son Magnus the Good from Russia to be their new king. They drove the Danes out. What became Nidaros Cathedral was raised over Olaf's grave, and Norway had found its patron saint. To this day, the kings of Norway are blessed in Nidaros Cathedral. In theory, they receive their crowns personally from Olaf himself, who is the perpetual king of Norway. How much of the story is true? How much is legend? How we answer that probably says as much about it as about Olaf. But this is true. Whatever you think about the man, and personally I'm not a big fan, through 4 centuries of Danish rule and nearly a century of Swedish rule, the Norwegians never forgot him. He was a rallying point. When those parents we talked about at the beginning, who brought their sons to the church and had them baptized Olaf, that was a statement of faith, but it was also a political statement. They were saying, we are not Danes. We are not Swedes. We are Norwegians. We are Olaf's people. Any questions? Yes?
So when you're talking about Denmark, would you say that the Danes and the Swedish and the British people would think that there's something rotten in Denmark?
If you like to think of it that way, yes. Yes?
You were talking about that Christianity was more established than people maybe thought
Yeah.
at that early stage. How did that happen? Did the Church of Rome come up there, or who was spreading it?
Yes, there's a possibility that, well, I won't go into old legends, but we know Håkon the Good, if you remember his name, was an early Christian king of Norway who failed to Christianize it, according to the sagas. Archaeologists who have noticed the change in grave customs, especially in southwest Norway, think that Håkon was probably more successful in his peaceful efforts to convert the country than the sagas give him credit for. The saga writers wanted to make the two Olafs great crusader heroes So they exaggerated how heathen the country was in order to give them sole credit for all the Christianity in Norway. But Håkon the Good's influence was probably more than the sagas suggest. Also, the Vikings are the most cosmopolitan people in the world. They went all over the place. They saw everything. They saw the prosperity in the Christian countries. They wanted that for themselves. There were political benefits to be had, or trade benefits, business benefits to be had from being a Christian, doing business in Europe. So all these things influenced them. You know, many slaves who came to Norway were Christians. They had some influence too. Well, if that's all, thank you very much.
Very good, Lars. Very good. Thank you.